1822 Missouri, the Redwell butchers were the couple who sold more than meat to their trusting customers. But what they were really selling would make your blood run cold. Ezra and Martha Redwell owned the most popular butcher shop in St. Louis. Everyone loved them. They fed the poor, helped widows, and always had the best cuts of meat in town, even when other shops ran empty. But Thomas Merrick, a young newspaper reporter, started noticing something terrifying. Young women kept disappearing from the neighborhood around their shop. Maria Santos, gone. Catherine Bloom, vanished. Rebecca Walsh, disappeared without a trace. Then the unthinkable happened. Thomas's own 16-year-old sister Emma went missing. Just like the others, here one day, gone the next, like she never existed. The authorities didn't care. Girls run away all the time, they said, but Thomas knew Emma would never leave him. She was all the family he had left. So he started digging, and what he discovered about the beloved Redwell butchers will haunt your nightmares forever. The shop that never ran out of meat, even during the harshest winters. The strange sweet smell that lingered beneath the sawdust. The way dogs refused to go near their storefront. And the timing. Fresh meat always appeared right after another girl vanished. Thomas broke into their shop one night. What he found in the basement beneath the respectable butcher shop was a chamber of horrors that proved the Redwells weren't just killers, they were something far worse. But when Thomas tried to expose them, the evidence vanished. The basement disappeared, and suddenly he was the one everyone thought was crazy. The Redwells had turned his investigation against him, making him look like a grief-stricken brother who'd lost his mind. With no one to believe him and Emma still missing, Thomas realized he had only one choice left. He would have to become the bait in his own trap, risking everything to get justice for his sister and all the other forgotten victims. Because in a town where the most trusted neighbors were actually monsters in disguise, where the people who fed the community were feeding on the community, how do you prove the unthinkable truth when the killers have fooled everyone, including the law itself? The Missouri Gazette occupied a narrow brick building on Main Street, wedged between Ferguson's Dry Goods and a boarding house that never seemed to have vacancies. In the autumn of 1822, St. Louis pulsed with the energy of a city caught between worlds. French colonial grace meeting American ambition, fur trade wealth mixing with frontier grit. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and possibility, though beneath it lurked something else entirely. Thomas Merrick arrived each morning before dawn, when the cobblestones still gleamed with dew, and the only sounds were his footsteps and the distant whistle of steamboats on the Mississippi. At 22, he possessed the lean frame of someone who'd grown up too fast, and the intense eyes of someone who noticed everything. His father had been a blacksmith before cholera took both parents 3 years earlier, leaving Thomas to raise his 16-year-old sister Emma on a newspaper apprentice's wages. The journal Thomas carried everywhere had belonged to his father, thick leather binding worn smooth by calloused hands. Now it held Thomas's careful observations about the city he thought he knew. Missing girls, strange patterns, questions that kept multiplying like shadows at dusk. "You're here early again." Editor Jeremiah Hartwell emerged from his office, coffee mug in hand, and skepticism etched into the lines around his eyes. Hartwell had run the Gazette for 15 years, long enough to develop a nose for stories that sold papers and a distaste for young men who asked too many questions. "Research, sir." Thomas gestured to the stack of back issues he'd been combing through. "I've been tracking reports of missing persons over the past 6 months. Hartwell's expression soured. "Son, half the people who come to St. Louis are running from something. The other half are chasing fool's gold dreams. Missing persons don't sell papers. What sells papers are stories about progress, commerce, the bright future we're building." But Thomas had already mapped the disappearances. 3 young women in 4 months, all between 16 and 20, all last seen in the same general area near the docks. Maria Santos, a seamstress who'd vanished after leaving work on a Tuesday evening. Catherine Bloom, who'd stepped out to buy bread and never returned. Most recently, Rebecca Walsh, a baker's daughter, who disappeared while making deliveries. The authorities dismissed them as runaways, Young women following sweethearts west or fleeing difficult circumstances or simply tired of frontier life's hardships. But Thomas had interviewed their families, had seen the genuine confusion and grief in their eyes. These weren't women planning escapes. They were women who'd vanished. I think there's a pattern, Mr. Hartwell. What these women all did was make choices we don't understand. Hartwell's voice carried the finality of someone who'd made similar pronouncements countless times. Now, I have a real assignment for you. The Redwell Butcher Shop is celebrating 15 years of serving this community. I want you to write a piece about pillars of our society, solid citizens who make St. Louis what it is. Thomas knew the Redwells by reputation. Everyone did. Ezra Redwell had arrived in St. Louis 7 years earlier with his wife Martha, carrying impressive references from butcher shops in Kentucky and Ohio. They'd quickly established themselves as more than mere tradesmen. Their shop provided the finest cuts in the city. Their prices remained fair even when game grew scarce, and their generosity toward widows and struggling families had earned them widespread admiration. Martha Redwell, in particular, had become something of a maternal figure in their neighborhood. She organized food collections for families hit by illness, mended clothes for children whose mothers had died, and always seemed to have a kind word for young women facing difficult circumstances. The Redwells embodied the frontier spirit at its best: hardworking, community-minded, prosperous without being ostentatious. Having grown up in the South, she had come to know work people as her own people. Write about good people doing good things, Hartwell continued. That's what our readers want to see. Thomas nodded and gathered his materials, but his mind remained fixed on the pattern he'd discovered. All 3 missing women had lived or worked within a few blocks of the Redwell shop. All had disappeared on days when fresh meat had appeared in unusual quantities at the shop's counter. Coincidence? Probably. But Thomas had learned from his father that coincidences deserved closer examination. The Redwell Butcher Shop occupied a corner building with large windows that showcased hanging sides of beef and pork, neat rows of sausages, and Martha's handwritten signs advertising daily specials. The shop always smelled of fresh sawdust and herbs, though something underneath, metallic and slightly sweet, made Thomas's stomach clench whenever he lingered too long. Ezra Redwell greeted Thomas with the hearty handshake of a man comfortable with his place in the world. At 45, he possessed the solid build of someone who'd spent years handling heavy carcasses, combined with the easy charm that made customers feel like family. His graying hair was always neat, his leather apron spotless despite his messy trade. "Mr. Merrick, welcome, welcome. Martha, look who's come to visit," the young journalist from the Gazette. Martha emerged from behind the counter, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 38, she retained traces of the beauty that had presumably attracted Ezra, though hard work and frontier life had carved lines around her eyes and mouth. What struck Thomas most was her immediate warmth, the way she clasped his hands and studied his face, as if genuinely interested in his well-being. "Thomas, dear, you look tired. Are you eating properly? A young man working so hard needs proper nourishment." The shop's interior revealed the prosperity of successful tradespeople. Quality knives hung in orderly rows, scales gleamed with careful maintenance, and the cutting blocks bore the smooth patina of daily use. But it was the abundance that impressed Thomas most. In a city where meat often grew scarce during harsh weather, or when hunting parties returned empty-handed, the Redwells never seemed to lack inventory. "Business appears excellent," Thomas observed, notebook ready, even with the challenges of frontier supply. Ezra's laugh carried genuine pride. "We've been blessed, truly blessed. The good Lord provides, and we've learned to make the most of every opportunity. When other suppliers falter, we find ways to keep our customers satisfied." "Ezra has contacts throughout the region," Martha added, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder. "Trappers and hunters who know they can count on fair dealing. We built trust over the years." Thomas scribbled notes while studying the couple's interaction. Their partnership appeared seamless, Martha handling customer relations with intuitive warmth, Ezra managing the practical aspects with methodical efficiency. They finished each other's sentences, moved around the shop and practiced synchronization, and treated their business like a shared mission. "And your involvement in community affairs?" Thomas prompted. "I understand you're quite generous with struggling families." Martha's eyes brightened. "Oh, that's simply Christian duty. When someone needs help, especially young women facing difficult circumstances, how could we turn away? I remember being young and uncertain myself. Sometimes a warm meal and a listening ear can change everything." As if summoned by the mention of young women, Emma Merrick appeared in the shop's window, waving from across the street where she worked at Mrs. Patterson's seamstress shop. Thomas waved back, noticing how Martha's gaze followed his gesture with particular interest. "Your sister?" Martha inquired. "Such a lovely girl. I've seen her walking to work, always so proper and well-behaved. She reminds me of myself at that age." "Emma's been taking care of herself quite well since our parents died," Thomas replied, pride evident in his voice. "She's stronger than she looks." "I'm sure she is," Martha said softly. "But everyone needs looking after sometimes, don't they? Even the strongest among us." Ezra was studying Thomas with the calculating look of a man sizing up livestock. "Your sister works long hours, doesn't she? I've noticed her leaving after dark some evenings. A young woman shouldn't be walking alone after sunset. Too many unsavory characters near the docks." The observation troubled Thomas. He'd warned Emma about staying late, but Mrs. Patterson paid by the piece and Emma needed every coin she could earn. The idea that strangers had noticed her evening routines sent a protective chill through his chest. "We look after each other," Thomas said carefully. "It's what family does." Of course, Martha agreed. "But please, tell your sister she's welcome to stop by any time. I often have stew simmering, and it's no trouble to set an extra bowl. Young women need proper nourishment to maintain their strength." The offer seemed genuinely kind, yet something in Martha's tone, a subtle possessiveness perhaps, made Thomas uneasy. He found himself studying her more closely, noting how her smile never quite reached her eyes, how her gaze lingered on his responses as if cataloging information. "That's very generous," Thomas said. "I'll mention it to her." "Please do. And Thomas, if you ever have concerns about Emma's safety, don't hesitate to come to us. We consider ourselves guardians of this neighborhood's well-being." The interview continued for another hour, covering the Redwells' arrival in St. Louis, their business philosophy, and their hopes for the city's future. Both spoke eloquently about community responsibility and frontier values, painting a picture of two people dedicated to serving others while building honest prosperity. Yet as Thomas walked home that evening, notebook filled with admiring quotes and heartwarming anecdotes, he couldn't shake a growing unease. Something about the Redwells felt carefully constructed, like a stage play performed for an audience of one. Their answers had been too smooth, their concern for Emma too immediate and specific. Most troubling was the meat itself. Thomas had grown up around his father's customers, had learned to recognize the difference between quality and pretense. The Redwell's inventory was impressive, but some cuts had possessed an unusual texture and color that didn't match any game he'd encountered. That night, Thomas spread his research across the small table in the kitchen he shared with Emma. The missing women's faces stared up from sketches provided by their families. Maria Santos, with her shy smile and careful handwriting. Catherine Bloom, whose mother described her as afraid of her own shadow but brave when others needed help. Rebecca Walsh, engaged to be married and excited about her future. All three had been kind, vulnerable, and trusting. All three had lived or worked near the Redwell shop. All three had vanished without explanation, leaving behind lives that suggested no intention of voluntary departure. Emma emerged from her room, already dressed for the next day's work. At 16, she possessed a quiet beauty that made Thomas fiercely protective. Their mother's delicate features combined with their father's determined chin. The loss of their parents had aged her, but traces of the laughing child she'd once been still surfaced in unguarded moments. "Working late again?" she asked, glancing at the papers scattered across the table. "Research," Thomas replied, carefully covering the sketches. "Just trying to understand some patterns." Emma studied his face with the perception that came from sharing years of hardship. The missing women? It wasn't a question. Thomas had never mentioned his investigation, but Emma possessed an intuitive understanding of his moods and obsessions. She'd always been the practical one, balancing his tendency toward abstract concerns with immediate necessities. People disappear for many reasons, she said gently. Sometimes they have no choice but to start over somewhere else, maybe. But these cases feel different. Emma poured herself a cup of water and sat across from him. Different how? Thomas considered sharing his suspicions but rejected the idea. Emma faced enough daily challenges without adding his paranoid theories to her burden. Instead, he gathered the papers into a neat stack. Just different timing, all clustered together, all young women about your age. He met her eyes directly. I want you to be extra careful walking home from work. Stay on main streets, avoid shortcuts, and if anyone approaches you, anyone, trust your instincts. Emma smiled with the patient tolerance of someone accustomed to protective older brothers. I'm always careful, Thomas. I've been taking care of myself just fine. I know you have, He struggled to articulate fears he couldn't quite define. Promise me you'll be extra cautious, and if anyone offers you special attention, food, companionship, help with anything, talk to me first. The request puzzled her, but Emma nodded. Of course. Though I can't imagine who would offer me anything special. I'm hardly the type to inspire grand gestures. Thomas wanted to tell her she was wrong, that her quiet strength and gentle nature made her exactly the type of person predators might target. Instead, he squeezed her hand and promised himself he'd watch over her more carefully. That night, dreams carried Thomas through shadowy streets where familiar faces wore unfamiliar expressions, where trusted neighbors revealed hidden appetites, and where his sister's voice called for help from places he couldn't reach. The morning Emma didn't come home marked the first time in 3 years that Thomas experienced true panic. She'd left for work at Mrs. Patterson's shop as usual, humming softly and pausing to braid her hair in the small mirror by their door. Thomas had been reviewing his notes about the missing women, cross-referencing dates and locations. When the afternoon shadows began lengthening without Emma's familiar footsteps on the stairs, by sunset his concern had transformed into cold dread. Mrs. Patterson confirmed that Emma had left the shop at her usual time, carrying finished alterations for 3 customers in the merchant district. The customers verified receiving their orders, but somewhere between the final delivery and home, Emma had simply vanished. Thomas searched every possible route, calling her name into alleyways and questioning strangers who might have noticed a young woman in a blue dress carrying a leather satchel. The night patrol offered polite sympathy, but little hope. Another young woman had likely run off with a suitor or decided city life wasn't for her. These things happened constantly on the frontier, but Thomas knew Emma. He knew her careful nature, her deep sense of responsibility, her love of routine and predictability. She would never disappear voluntarily, would never cause him worry without explanation. Whatever had happened to her hadn't been her choice. The realization hit him like physical blow. Emma had become another entry in his list of missing women. Dawn found Thomas sitting at their kitchen table staring at 4 sketches instead of 3. He'd drawn Emma's face from memory, trying to capture the determined set of her jaw and the gentle humor in her eyes. Now she joined Maria Santos, Catherine Bloom, and Rebecca Walsh in the growing collection of women who'd vanished from St. Louis without trace or explanation. The pattern was undeniable now. All 4 women had been young, kind, and vulnerable in different ways. All had lived or worked in the same neighborhood. All had disappeared during daylight hours while going about normal activities. And all their disappearances had coincided with fresh meat appearing at the Redwell butcher's shop. Thomas sat with this knowledge for hours, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't want to fit. The Redwells had been nothing but kind to him, had expressed genuine concern for Emma's well-being, had built their reputation on generosity and community service. The idea that they might be connected to the disappearances seemed absurd, impossible, offensive. Yet the evidence was there. Thomas had documented it carefully, had verified the dates and circumstances, The correlation between missing women and fresh inventory couldn't be explained by coincidence. By afternoon, Thomas had made a decision that terrified him. He would visit the Redwell shop, not as a journalist seeking a story, but as a desperate brother following his only lead. He would observe carefully, ask subtle questions, and try to determine whether his suspicions had any foundation in reality. The shop appeared exactly as it had during his previous visit. Clean, well-organized, abundantly stocked. Martha greeted him with her characteristic warmth, though Thomas thought he detected something new in her expression. A watchfulness, perhaps, or a slight tension around her eyes. "Thomas, dear, how lovely to see you again. I hope you're well." "Actually, I'm worried about my sister," Thomas said, watching her reaction carefully. "She didn't come home yesterday evening. I wondered if you might have seen her in the neighborhood." Martha's expression shifted to immediate concern. "Oh my goodness, how terrible. Poor Emma. No, I haven't seen her since she waved from across the street during your visit. Have you contacted the authorities?" "They think she ran off," Thomas replied, bitterness creeping into his voice. "They see another young woman and assume she made impulsive choices. But surely they'll investigate properly. A missing person is serious business." Thomas studied Martha's face, searching for any sign of deception. She appeared genuinely distressed, her maternal instincts seemingly activated by news of a missing girl. Either she was an exceptional actress, or Thomas's suspicions were completely wrong. "The patrol captain suggested I check with local businesses," Thomas continued, "in case anyone noticed unusual activity or strangers in the area." Of course. "Ezra, come here, please. Thomas is asking about his missing sister." Ezra emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a blood-stained apron. His face immediately creased with concern when he heard about Emma's disappearance. "Missing since yesterday? My God, Thomas, you must be beside yourself with worry." "I am," Thomas admitted. "I keep thinking about what you said, about noticing her walking alone after dark. Maybe someone else noticed her routines, someone with bad intentions." The Redwells exchanged a quick glance, so brief Thomas almost missed it. In that microsecond of silent communication, he glimpsed something that made his stomach clench with dread. Not surprise or confusion, but recognition, as if Emma's disappearance wasn't news to them. "We'll certainly keep our eyes open," Martha said quickly. "And please, don't hesitate to ask if you need anything, meals, assistance with searches, anything at all. We're here for you." "Actually," Ezra added thoughtfully, "there was something odd yesterday evening. I noticed a stranger near the shop around closing time. A rough-looking fellow, not from the neighborhood. He seemed to be watching the area, particularly interested in young women passing by." Thomas felt a flicker of hope mixed with deeper suspicion. The detail was exactly what he needed to hear, but it felt manufactured, too convenient. A helpful stranger appearing precisely when Thomas needed an alternative explanation for Emma's disappearance. "Can you describe him?" Thomas asked, pulling out his notebook. "Average height, dark hair, worn clothes, the type who might be working the docks or traveling through. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now..." Ezra shook his head regretfully. "I should have paid closer attention." Marta placed a comforting hand on Thomas's arm. "Don't blame yourself for not preventing what you couldn't have predicted. And don't give up hope. Emma strikes me as a resourceful young woman. She'll find her way home." But as Thomas left the shop, notebook filled with descriptions of a convenient stranger, his suspicions had hardened into something approaching certainty. The Redwells' performance had been flawless. Too flawless. Their concern felt rehearsed, their helpful details too perfectly aligned with what a desperate brother needed to hear. Most damning was that brief exchange of glances. In that unguarded moment, Thomas had glimpsed recognition rather than surprise. The Redwells had known about Emma's disappearance before he told them. That evening, Thomas sat in their empty kitchen, surrounded by the domestic details of Emma's life. Her favorite cup, still bearing traces of yesterday morning's coffee. The mending she'd been working on, needle still threaded and waiting for her return. the small mirror where she'd braided her hair for the last time. The silence felt crushing. For 3 years, this space had echoed with Emma's quiet humming, her gentle questions about his work, her practical observations about their daily struggles. Now it contained only Thomas and his growing certainty that his sister was gone, that she'd become another victim in a pattern of disappearances that somehow connected to the most respected butchers in St. Louis. Thomas opened his journal to a fresh page and began writing, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his chest. If the Redwells were responsible for Emma's disappearance, if his gentle, trusting sister had become prey for predators hiding behind community respectability, then he would expose them. He would find proof, no matter how carefully they'd hidden it. He would make them pay for taking Emma, but first he had to make sure she was truly gone, had to exhaust every possible explanation before accepting the unthinkable. The investigation he'd started as professional curiosity had become a personal mission. Thomas Merrick, failed protector and desperate brother, would either save his sister or ensure that her disappearance led to justice for all the missing women. The stakes had never been more personal or more terrifying. Thomas spent the next 3 days in a methodical frenzy of investigation that bordered on obsession. Sleep came in fragments between bursts of research and increasingly desperate searches through every corner of St. Louis where Emma might be hidden. The rational part of his mind recognized that his behavior was attracting attention. Concerned neighbors whispered about the young man who walked the streets at all hours, calling his sister's name into empty alleys and abandoned buildings. But rationality felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Every hour that passed without finding Emma made her survival less likely, made the possibility of recovering her intact more remote. Thomas had read enough missing person reports to understand the brutal mathematics of disappearance. After 72 hours, hope became a form of self-delusion. Editor Hartwell initially offered sympathetic understanding, allowing Thomas several days away from his newspaper duties to search for Emma, but by the 4th day, practical concerns reasserted themselves. "Son, you need to accept reality," Hartwell said gently, finding Thomas hunched over a map in the Gazette office, marking search areas with increasingly frantic notations. "Young women disappear on the frontier. It's tragic, but it happens. You can't stop living because your sister made choices you don't understand." Thomas looked up from his map, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and grief. "Emma didn't make choices. Something happened to her. Someone took her." "Based on what evidence?" "Thomas, I understand your pain, but you're constructing elaborate theories without foundation. The Redwells? Really? They're pillars of this community. Ezra Redwell has fed half the widows in this city, and Marta has clothed more orphans than the church." "The timing isn't coincidental," Thomas insisted, spreading his research across Hartwell's desk. "Every disappearance correlates with fresh inventory at their shop. Maria Santos vanished on September 15th. The Redwells received an unusual shipment of venison that same day. Catherine Bloom disappeared October 3rd, another large delivery. Rebecca Walsh, October 20th. "Correlation isn't causation," Hartwell interrupted. "Butchers receive meat deliveries constantly. That's their business. But not from documented sources. I've checked with every hunting party, every trapping expedition, every legitimate supplier in the region. None of them can account for the quantity and timing of meat the Redwells have been selling." Hartwell studied Thomas's charts and notes with growing concern. The young man's handwriting, normally careful and precise, had become erratic. Cross-references sprawled across multiple pages, connected by lines that suggested thought processes approaching the irrational. "Thomas, you need rest. You need perspective. You're seeing patterns that don't exist because you're desperate to find someone to blame for your sister's disappearance." "I'm seeing patterns that everyone else is too comfortable to acknowledge," Thomas replied. "The Redwells have been operating in plain sight, using their reputation as cover for something unthinkable." That afternoon, Thomas took his suspicions to Captain Morrison, the territorial constable responsible for maintaining order in St. Louis' growing chaos. Morrison was a practical man who'd earned his position through competence rather than connections, but he possessed the frontier lawman's deep skepticism toward theories that couldn't be proven with physical evidence. Let me understand your accusation, Mr. Merrick. You believe the Redwell butchers are murdering young women and, what, selling their meat to customers? Thomas recognized how insane it sounded when spoken aloud, but pressed forward anyway. I believe they're somehow connected to the disappearances. The timing is too consistent to ignore. The timing of meat deliveries matching missing persons reports. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with grief-driven paranoia. Son, I've known the Redwells for 7 years. They're decent people who've never given me cause for concern. Have you investigated their suppliers, verified their sources? I don't investigate law-abiding citizens without probable cause, and reputation matters in a community like this. The Redwells have earned trust through years of honest dealing. Thomas left Morrison's office with the crushing realization that no one would take his suspicions seriously without concrete evidence. The Redwells' community standing provided perfect camouflage. Who would suspect the neighborhood's most generous benefactors of predatory behavior? That evening, Thomas made a decision that his rational mind recognized as dangerous. He would conduct surveillance of the Redwell shop, watching for unusual activity that might provide the proof authorities demanded. If Emma was being held somewhere, if other women were in immediate danger, he couldn't wait for official skepticism to transform into action. The Redwell shop closed at sunset, but lights continued burning in the back rooms well into the evening. Thomas positioned himself across the street, using the shadows of Ferguson's dry goods to observe the building's rear entrance. For 3 nights, he watched without seeing anything more suspicious than late evening cleaning and inventory management. On the 4th night, his patience was rewarded with something that made his blood freeze. Around midnight, Ezra Redwell emerged from the shop's back door carrying what appeared to be a large bundle wrapped in canvas. The bundle was roughly human-sized and seemed to require considerable effort to handle. Ezra loaded it into a small cart and began pulling it toward the outskirts of town, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who didn't want to attract attention. Thomas followed at a distance, staying in shadows and timing his movement to avoid detection. The cart's wheels squeaked softly against cobblestones, creating a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the sleeping city. Ezra moved with obvious familiarity, taking shortcuts through alleys and avoiding main thoroughfares where late-night patrols might notice unusual activity. The destination proved to be a small clearing beside the Mississippi River, where the current ran fast and deep. Thomas watched from behind a stand of oak trees as Ezra unwrapped his bundle, revealing what appeared to be bones and refuse from butchering operations. The waste was weighted with stones and pushed into the river, where it disappeared beneath dark water that would carry all evidence toward the Gulf of Mexico. It was a logical disposal method for a butcher's waste, but the secretive timing and location suggested something more sinister than routine sanitation. Thomas crept closer, hoping to identify specific contents of the bundle, but Ezra completed his work quickly and began the return journey before closer inspection was possible. The next morning, Thomas approached the riverbank disposal site, searching for any evidence that might have been overlooked. The muddy ground revealed cart tracks and boot prints, but no obvious traces of human remains. However, caught on a piece of driftwood near the water's edge, Thomas found a small fragment of blue fabric that made his heart stop. Emma had been wearing a blue dress when she disappeared. The fabric scrap was small, barely larger than a coin, but the color and weave matched Thomas's memory perfectly. It could have come from any number of sources, but its presence at the Redwell's disposal site felt like confirmation of his worst fears. Thomas spent the rest of that day in a strange, detached calm that worried him more than his previous desperation. The fabric represented either proof of Emma's death or evidence of his descent into paranoid delusion. Either way, it marked a point of no return in his investigation. That evening, he returned to the Redwell shop with a different purpose. No longer the grieving brother seeking help, he came as a predator studying prey, He would find a way inside the building, would search for proof of what the Redwells had done to Emma and the other missing women. The shop's front entrance was secured with quality locks that would require skills Thomas didn't possess. But the rear door, the same entrance Ezra had used for his midnight disposal run, showed signs of being opened frequently after hours. The lock appeared newer than the door itself, suggesting recent installation, but the wood around the frame bore scratches and wear patterns that might indicate weaknesses. As Thomas examined the door, he heard voices from within the building. The Redwells were still working, their conversation muffled but audible through the walls. Thomas pressed his ear to the wood, straining to make out words that might provide crucial information. "Careful with the next one," Martha was saying. "Too much attention already." "The brother won't give up easily," Ezra replied. "He's more persistent than the others." "Then we'll have to be more convincing, or find a permanent solution." Thomas felt ice forming in his chest. They were discussing him, discussing Emma, discussing other victims with the casual efficiency of people who'd had similar conversations many times before. "The meat from the last one was excellent quality," Martha continued. "Young, healthy, well-fed. Our customers have been very satisfied." Thomas pressed harder against the door, desperate to hear more, but his shifting weight caused a loose board to creak loudly. The conversation inside stopped abruptly. "What was that?" Martha's voice carried sharp alarm. "I'll check outside," Ezra replied. Thomas heard heavy footsteps approaching the door and realized he had seconds to escape before discovery. He slipped into the shadows between buildings just as the rear door opened and Ezra's silhouette appeared against the interior light. From his hiding place, Thomas watched Ezra scan the alley, lamp held high to illuminate potential threats. The butcher's expression was alert and dangerous, the look of a predator who sensed nearby prey. "Nothing here," Ezra called back to his wife. "Probably just rats or cats." But Thomas had heard enough to confirm his worst suspicions. The Redwells weren't just connected to the disappearances. They were directly responsible for them. They were killing young women and selling their flesh to unsuspecting customers, hiding their cannibalistic business behind the respectability of legitimate butchering. Emma was dead. The other missing women were dead, and Thomas was the only person who knew the truth about St. Louis's most trusted merchants. The realization brought a strange sense of clarity. His investigation had revealed unthinkable evil, but it had also revealed his purpose. He would expose the Redwells, would ensure they faced justice for their crimes. But first, he needed proof that would convince skeptical authorities and overcome the killer's carefully constructed reputations. Thomas Merrick, failed protector of his sister, would become the instrument of justice for all their victims. The Redwells had made their final mistake by underestimating the persistence of someone who had nothing left to lose. The transformation in Thomas was immediately apparent to anyone who knew him well. The frantic desperation that had characterized his first week of searching for Emma had crystallized into something harder and more focused. He moved through St. Louis with the purposeful stride of a man who had found his calling, though what others didn't realize was that his calling had become vengeance disguised as justice. Editor Hartwell noticed the change immediately when Thomas returned to work at the Gazette. Gone was the obsessive researcher poring over missing person reports. In his place sat a methodical investigator who asked careful questions and took precise notes. The change was both reassuring and unsettling. "You seem more settled," Hartwell observed, watching Thomas organize his materials with mechanical precision. "I hope that means you're accepting Emma's situation." "I'm accepting the need to work within existing systems," Thomas replied, not looking up from his notebook. "Personal feelings can't override professional responsibilities." But Thomas's professional responsibilities had been redefined in ways Hartwell couldn't imagine. Every article assignment became an opportunity to gather intelligence about the Redwells. Every interview with local merchants provided chances to ask subtle questions about meat suppliers and customer relationships. Thomas was building a case, piece by piece, using his journalist credentials to access information that would be unavailable to private citizens. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns that went beyond simple correlation. Thomas discovered that the Redwells had moved to St. Louis shortly after a series of unexplained disappearances in their previous location, a small town in Ohio where 3 young women had vanished over the course of 2 years. Local records indicated that the Redwells had left Ohio suddenly, citing family obligations, but their departure coincided almost exactly with increased scrutiny from local authorities. More troubling were the business records Thomas managed to access through his newspaper connections. The Redwells' meat purchases from legitimate suppliers accounted for perhaps 60% of their inventory. The remainder came from unspecified sources, paid for in cash, with no documentation of origin or quality inspection. For a business that prided itself on providing the finest cuts to discerning customers, this lack of sourcing transparency suggested something more sinister than simple business irregularities. Thomas also discovered that several of the Redwells' most loyal customers had begun experiencing unusual health problems over the past year. Stomach ailments, digestive issues, and general malaise that their physicians couldn't diagnose. While these symptoms might result from various causes, Thomas couldn't help noting that they affected primarily families who regularly purchased the Redwells' specialty items, the premium cuts that were supposedly reserved for the shop's best customers. The more Thomas learned, the more convinced he became that the Redwells had been operating their horrific business for years, possibly decades. They were experienced predators who had perfected their methods through trial and error, learning to identify vulnerable victims and eliminate evidence with professional efficiency. But understanding their operation was only half the challenge Thomas faced. The greater difficulty lay in finding proof that would convince authorities to take action against pillars of the community. The Redwells' reputation provided almost impenetrable protection. No one wanted to believe that their neighbors, the people who had fed their families and supported their community, were capable of unthinkable evil. Thomas needed physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, or a confession. Since confession seemed unlikely and eyewitnesses were presumably dead, his focus turned to finding concrete proof of the Redwells' crimes. This decision led Thomas to undertake increasingly dangerous reconnaissance missions. He began spending entire nights watching the Redwell shop, documenting patterns of activity and looking for opportunities to search the premises. The building appeared to have extensive basement space, much larger than would be necessary for normal butchering operations, and Thomas suspected that this underground area contained evidence of the Redwells' true activities. The basement could only be accessed through the shop itself, which meant Thomas would need to find a way inside despite locks, security precautions, and the constant risk of discovery. He spent days studying the building's architecture, timing the Redwells' movements, and identifying potential entry points that might provide access without detection. The opportunity came during the first week of November, when Martha Redwell mentioned to several customers that she and Ezra would be attending a church social that evening. The event would last several hours and was being held across town, providing a window of time when the shop would be genuinely unoccupied. Thomas had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He'd practiced lockpicking, using techniques learned from his blacksmith father, had studied the shop's layout through careful observation, and had identified the most likely location of evidence that might prove the Redwells' guilt. Everything depended on gaining access to the basement and finding proof before the owners returned. The rear door lock proved more challenging than Thomas had anticipated, but patience and determination eventually yielded success. The mechanism clicked open just after 11 o'clock, and Thomas slipped inside the dark shop with his heart hammering against his ribs. The familiar space felt entirely different in darkness. Hanging meat casts strange shadows. The usual scent of sawdust and herbs now carried undertones that made Thomas's stomach clench, and every small sound seemed amplified to dangerous volumes. Thomas moved carefully toward the basement stairs, using a small lantern to provide minimal illumination while avoiding windows that might alert passing patrol officers. The basement exceeded Thomas's worst expectations. What he found below the respectable butcher shop was a chamber of horrors that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The space had been divided into sections. One area for what appeared to be legitimate butchering operations, another that contained holding cells clearly designed for human prisoners, and a third section that Thomas recognized as a processing area where human remains had been systematically dismembered and prepared for consumption. The holding cells were constructed with professional skill, featuring strong bars and secure locks that would prevent escape, even by desperate prisoners. Chains and shackles attached to the walls bore dark stains that Thomas preferred not to identify. Most horrifying were the scratches carved into the wooden posts, desperate marks left by victims who had tried to escape their fate. In the processing area, Thomas found evidence that confirmed his worst suspicions about the Redwell's business model. Specialized knives designed for human anatomy, tables sized for human bodies, and drainage systems that would efficiently dispose of blood and other fluids. This wasn't the work of opportunistic killers. It was the infrastructure of professionals who had been perfecting their craft for years. But it was the personal effects area that nearly broke Thomas's emotional control. Carefully organized on wooden shelves were belongings of the Redwell's victims: jewelry, clothing, personal items that had been kept as trophies or simply hadn't been disposed of yet. Thomas found Maria Santos's silver necklace, still bearing the intricate cross that her family had described. Catherine Bloom's distinctive hair ribbons, which her mother had said she never went anywhere without. Rebecca Walsh's engagement ring, which should have been buried with her or returned to her grieving fiancé, and there, on a shelf containing the most recent acquisitions, Thomas found Emma's leather satchel, the one she'd been carrying when she left for work on the morning she disappeared. The satchel still contained her needlework supplies, the small mirror she used to check her appearance, and a folded piece of paper with Thomas's handwriting. He had written her a note several weeks earlier, reminding her to be careful walking home after dark, and telling her how proud he was of her strength and independence. Thomas held the note with shaking hands, remembering the moment he'd written it, remembering Emma's smile when she'd read his words. The paper represented the last communication between them, a final expression of love from a brother who had failed to protect the person who mattered most to him. The grief that crashed over Thomas in that basement was unlike anything he had experienced, even when their parents died. This wasn't the natural tragedy of disease or accident. This was the result of human evil, of predators who had targeted his gentle sister and transformed her into meat for their unsuspecting customers. But grief wasn't the only emotion Thomas felt in that chamber of horrors. Rage built in his chest, clean and focused and entirely justified. The Redwells had taken Emma from him, had taken Maria and Catherine and Rebecca from their families, had probably taken dozens of other women whose disappearances hadn't been properly investigated. They had built their prosperity on murdered innocence and hidden their crimes behind community respectability. Thomas spent 2 hours documenting everything he found in the basement, taking detailed notes and sketching evidence that would prove the Redwells' guilt beyond question. But he also spent time studying the operational aspects of their system, understanding how they had managed to kill and process victims without detection. The knowledge would be useful when Thomas decided how the Redwells should pay for their crimes. As he prepared to leave the basement, Thomas heard sounds from the shop above. Footsteps and voices that indicated the Redwells had returned earlier than expected from their church social. Thomas quickly extinguished his lantern and moved toward the stairs, hoping to escape through the rear door before discovery. But the voices were already too close. He was trapped in the basement with evidence of the Redwells' crimes all around him, and his only hope was that they wouldn't have reason to check their underground operations that evening. The footsteps moved directly overhead, accompanied by Martha's voice discussing the evening's social activities with Ezra. They seemed to be conducting normal end-of-day routines, securing the shop and preparing for the next day's business. Thomas pressed himself into the darkest corner of the basement and waited, controlling his breathing and praying that simple routine wouldn't bring either Redwell downstairs. For 20 minutes, Thomas remained frozen in place, listening to domestic conversations and normal business sounds. Eventually, the voices faded and lights went out, suggesting that the Redwells had retired to their living quarters above the shop. Thomas waited another hour before attempting to leave, moving with infinite care to avoid any sound that might alert the killers to his presence. The rear door opened silently, and Thomas slipped into the alley with his notebook full of evidence and his heart full of terrible purpose. The Redwells had made their final mistake by keeping trophies of their victims. Thomas now possessed proof that would convince even the most skeptical authorities, evidence that would finally bring justice for Emma and all the other missing women. But as Thomas walked home through the empty streets of St. Louis, he wondered whether official justice would be sufficient punishment for crimes so monstrous. The Redwells had spent years murdering innocent women and feeding their flesh to unsuspecting neighbors. They deserved consequences that matched the magnitude of their evil. Thomas Merrick had entered the Redwell basement as a grief-stricken brother seeking proof of his sister's fate. He emerged as something else entirely, an agent of justice who would ensure that monsters disguised as neighbors received exactly what they deserved. Thomas spent the morning after his basement discovery preparing to present his evidence to Captain Morrison, organizing his notes and sketches into a comprehensive report that would finally force authorities to take action against the Redwells. He had physical proof, documented patterns, and enough circumstantial evidence to convince even the most skeptical investigator that St. Louis's most respected butchers were systematic killers. But when Thomas arrived at Morrison's office, he found the constable deep in conversation with a familiar figure, Ezra Redwell himself. "Ah, Mr. Merrick," Morrison said as Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Perfect timing. Mr. Redwell has just brought me some disturbing information about your recent behavior." Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. Ezra turned toward him with an expression of concerned regret, playing his role as the worried community leader to perfection. "Thomas, my boy," Ezra said sadly, "I'm afraid I had to tell Captain Morrison about finding evidence of your activities around our shop. I know you're grief-stricken about your sister, but breaking into private property crosses a line that can't be ignored." "Breaking in?" Thomas managed to say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Morrison pulled out a leather satchel that Thomas recognized with sick certainty. It was Emma's bag, the one he'd found in the Redwell's basement trophy collection. "Mr. Redwell found this hidden behind his shop this morning," Morrison said, "along with various personal items that appear to belong to other missing women. It seems someone has been planting evidence trying to frame the Redwells for crimes they didn't commit." Thomas stared at the satchel, understanding with terrible clarity what had happened. The Redwells had discovered his nighttime visit, had realized that their basement secrets were no longer safe, and had moved quickly to neutralize the threat he represented. "Those items were in their basement," Thomas said desperately. "I saw them there. The Redwells are keeping trophies from their victims." Ezra's expression became even more sorrowful. "Captain Morrison, this is exactly what I was afraid of. The poor boy has become obsessed with the idea that we're responsible for his sister's disappearance. I think he's actually convinced himself that his delusions are reality." Morrison studied Thomas with the patient look of a man who'd seen grief drive people to irrational behavior many times before. "Son, I understand your desperation to find someone to blame, but framing innocent citizens won't bring Emma back. They're not innocent." Thomas pulled out his notebook, frantically turning to pages of evidence he'd compiled. "I have documentation of their activities, patterns that prove—" "You have theories," Morrison interrupted. "Theories driven by grief and desperation. The Redwells have been nothing but helpful in looking for your sister. They've shown genuine concern and offered every assistance. And now you're accusing them of murder based on your own planted evidence." Thomas realized with growing horror that the Redwells had played this scenario perfectly. By discovering the evidence outside their shop rather than in their basement, they'd transformed his proof into apparent fabrication. His investigation had been turned against him, his dedication to finding truth reframed as obsessive delusion. "Mr. Redwell," Morrison continued, "you mentioned that Thomas has been conducting surveillance of your property." "I'm afraid so," Ezra replied reluctantly. "We've noticed him lurking around the shop at odd hours, watching our movements, following Martha when she makes deliveries to customers. It's been quite unsettling, but we haven't wanted to complain because we understand his emotional state." "I was investigating," Thomas protested. "I was trying to find evidence of their crimes." By stalking law-abiding citizens and planting fake evidence, Morrison's voice carried disappointment rather than anger, as if he'd expected better from the young journalist. Thomas, you've crossed serious legal boundaries. Mr. Redwell would be within his rights to press charges for harassment and attempted frame-up. Ezra held up a placating hand. I don't want to add to the boy's troubles, Captain Morrison. He's clearly suffering from his sister's disappearance. Perhaps what he needs is help, not punishment. Thomas watched this performance with sick fascination. Ezra was positioning himself as the compassionate victim, more concerned with Thomas's well-being than with his own reputation. It was masterful manipulation, designed to make Thomas appear unstable while reinforcing the Redwells' image as pillars of the community. However, Ezra continued, I do think Thomas needs professional help dealing with his grief and these elaborate fantasies he's constructed. Perhaps some time away from St. Louis would be beneficial, somewhere he can receive proper care. The implication was clear. The Redwells were offering Thomas a choice. Accept institutionalization for his delusions, or face criminal charges for harassment and evidence tampering. Either way, his investigation would end and his credibility would be destroyed. I won't stop looking for the truth, Thomas said quietly. I know what I saw in that basement. Ezra's expression became pitying. Thomas, there is no basement beneath our shop. The building sits directly on bedrock. Everyone in the neighborhood knows that. Your mind has created an elaborate fiction to cope with loss you can't accept. Thomas felt reality tilting around him. The basement had been real. He'd spent hours documenting its horrors, had touched Emma's belongings, had seen the evidence of the Redwells' crimes. But how could he prove the existence of something that apparently didn't exist? Captain Morrison, Thomas said desperately, request permission to search the Redwell shop. If there's no basement, if I'm delusional, then searching will prove that quickly enough. Morrison exchanged a look with Ezra, who nodded reluctantly. I suppose that would settle the matter conclusively, Ezra said, though I hate to subject Martha to such an intrusion based on these fantasies. An hour later, Thomas stood in the Redwell shop as Morrison conducted a thorough search of the premises. The basement stairs were gone. The entrance Thomas had used to access the underground chamber had been sealed and disguised so expertly that no trace remained. When Morrison examined the floor where the basement access should have been, he found solid planking over bedrock, exactly as Ezra had claimed. The Redwells had spent the hours after discovering Thomas's visit eliminating all evidence of their basement operations. They'd moved their victims' belongings, sealed the access points, and prepared their counter-narrative with professional efficiency. Thomas's investigation had been anticipated and neutralized before he'd even realized the danger. As you can see, Martha said gently as the search concluded, there's nothing here but a normal butcher shop. Poor Thomas has imagined something that simply doesn't exist. Thomas stood in the empty shop, staring at floorboards that concealed nothing but bedrock, knowing that 24 hours earlier this same space had contained chambers of horror that would haunt his dreams forever. The Redwells had eliminated their basement operations so completely that he began to doubt his own memories. Son, Morrison said, not unkindly, I think Mr. Redwell is right about you needing help. These delusions are vivid and detailed, but they're not real. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can begin healing. As they left the shop, Thomas caught Martha watching him with an expression that chilled his blood. For just a moment, her mask of maternal concern slipped, revealing something predatory and satisfied. She knew exactly what she'd done to him. Knew that she'd destroyed his credibility and his investigation with surgical precision. But in that brief exchange of looks, Thomas also saw something else. Confirmation that his memories of the basement were real, that his investigation had been accurate, and that the Redwells were exactly the monsters he'd believed them to be. The twist wasn't that Thomas had been wrong about the Redwells' guilt. The twist was that being right didn't matter if he couldn't prove it, and the Redwells were far more dangerous and cunning than he'd imagined. They'd not only eliminated evidence of their crimes, they'd transformed his pursuit of justice into proof of his instability. Thomas Merrick, seeker of truth, had become Thomas Merrick, delusional grief victim whose accusations could be dismissed as the fantasies of a broken mind. But Martha's momentary lapse had revealed that the game wasn't over. The Redwells thought they'd neutralized him, but they'd underestimated the depths of his determination. Thomas would find another way to expose them, would discover proof they couldn't eliminate or discredit. The hunt for justice had become more dangerous, but Thomas's commitment had only grown stronger. The weeks following Thomas's failed attempt to expose the Redwells marked the darkest period of his life. Officially diagnosed with grief-induced delusions and temporarily suspended from his position at the Gazette, he found himself isolated from the community that had once respected his journalistic integrity. Friends and neighbors now looked at him with pity mixed with concern, seeing a young man who'd been broken by loss and was constructing elaborate fantasies to avoid accepting painful reality. But Thomas knew what he had seen in that basement. The memory of Emma's satchel, of the victim's personal belongings, of the holding cells and processing equipment remained vivid, despite the Redwells' successful elimination of physical evidence. The knowledge that his sister had been murdered and her flesh sold to unsuspecting customers burned in his chest like acid. Impossible to ignore or forget. The isolation forced Thomas to confront a terrible truth. Conventional justice had failed. The legal system, dependent on evidence and community credibility, couldn't touch predators who had perfected their deception over years of practice. The Redwells were too smart, too careful, and too well established to be exposed through normal investigative channels. If Emma and the other victims were going to receive justice, Thomas would have to provide it himself. This realization transformed his approach entirely. Instead of gathering evidence for authorities who wouldn't believe him, Thomas began planning a different kind of confrontation. One that would force the Redwells to reveal their true nature, regardless of their carefully constructed reputation. The plan that emerged from weeks of careful thought was elegant in its simplicity. Thomas would make himself irresistible bait, presenting himself as a vulnerable target that the Redwells couldn't resist taking. But unlike their previous victims, he would be prepared for what awaited him, armed with knowledge of their methods and determined to expose them, even if it cost him his life. Thomas began by changing his behavior patterns, becoming more obviously disturbed and isolated in ways that would signal psychological vulnerability to predators who specialized in identifying suitable prey. He started drinking heavily in public taverns, muttering about his sister's disappearance and his inability to find answers. He withdrew from social connections, appearing increasingly desperate and unhinged. Most importantly, Thomas began expressing suicidal ideation in contexts where the Redwells were likely to hear about it. He spoke to bartenders about feeling responsible for Emma's fate, told former colleagues that life wasn't worth living without his sister, and generally created the impression of someone approaching complete emotional collapse. The strategy was designed to trigger the Redwells' predatory instincts while simultaneously providing cover for what Thomas planned to do next. If a disturbed young man disappeared after expressing suicidal thoughts, authorities would likely conclude he'd taken his own life rather than fallen victim to foul play. The Redwells would see an opportunity to eliminate their primary threat while adding to their victim count. But Thomas's preparations went far beyond simple psychological bait. He spent hours studying the Redwells' operational patterns, timing their movements and identifying the most likely scenarios for how they would approach capturing him. Based on his basement reconnaissance, Thomas understood their preference for taking victims alive and processing them in controlled circumstances, rather than killing them quickly in random locations. This knowledge informed every aspect of Thomas's counter-strategy. He prepared multiple weapons and hid them in locations where he might be taken, studied escape routes from various parts of the city, and most importantly, documented everything he was doing in detailed letters that would be delivered to specific people if he failed to prevent their delivery by a predetermined date. The letters contained complete descriptions of Thomas's investigation, copies of his evidence, and explicit instructions for how to locate and expose the Redwells if Thomas himself disappeared. He'd learned from his previous mistake of working alone. This time, other people would know the truth and have means to act on it if necessary. Thomas also prepared more immediate insurance in the form of a chemical compound he'd obtained through contacts in the newspaper's printing operation. The substance was designed to induce violent illness in anyone who consumed it, and Thomas intended to use it to contaminate any meat the Redwells might prepare from his remains. If they killed him and sold his flesh to customers, at least those customers would become sick enough to demand explanations that might expose the entire operation. The psychological preparation proved even more challenging than the practical arrangements. Thomas had to accept that he might not survive his confrontation with the Redwells, that his quest for justice might require the ultimate sacrifice. But the alternative, allowing Emma's killers to continue operating with impunity, was unacceptable. Every night, Thomas sat in the kitchen he'd shared with Emma, writing in the journal that had once belonged to their father. The entries documented his investigation, his discoveries, and his growing certainty that conventional approaches to justice had been exhausted. If legal methods couldn't stop the Redwells, then Thomas would find extra-legal methods that could. The waiting was the hardest part. Thomas had made himself obvious bait, but the Redwells were patient predators who wouldn't act until conditions were perfect for their purposes. He maintained his performance of psychological deterioration while secretly preparing for the confrontation he knew must come. The break came on a cold December evening when Thomas was leaving Murphy's Tavern after another public display of drunken desperation. As he stumbled through the alley behind the establishment, muttering about Emma and expressing wishes that he could join her in death, he noticed footsteps following him at a discreet distance. Thomas had expected this moment for weeks, but the reality still sent adrenaline shooting through his system. The hunt was beginning, and he was both predator and prey in a game where only one side would survive. He continued his performance of intoxicated depression while using reflective surfaces to monitor his pursuers. There were two figures, moving with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this many times before. Thomas recognized their general bills as matching the Redwells, though darkness and distance made positive identification impossible. The followers maintained their distance as Thomas made his way through increasingly isolated streets, allowing him to lead them toward the industrial area near the docks where screams wouldn't attract attention and bodies could be disposed of easily. Thomas had scouted this area extensively, had identified multiple escape routes and weapon caches that might provide advantages if his plan went wrong. As he turned into a narrow alley between two abandoned warehouses, Thomas heard the footsteps quicken behind him. The approach was beginning, and he had perhaps minutes before the Redwells revealed themselves and attempted to capture him. Thomas allowed himself to stumble against a warehouse wall, playing the part of someone too drunk to maintain balance. He muttered Emma's name and something about joining her, providing perfect justification for whatever the Redwells planned to do next. "Are you all right, son?" The voice was Ezra's, warm with concern and paternal solicitude. "You seem to be in distress." Thomas turned to find both Redwells approaching from the alley mouth, cutting off his retreat while presenting themselves as good Samaritans helping a troubled young man. Martha carried a small basket that probably contained the drugs they used to subdue victims, while Ezra positioned himself to prevent escape attempts. "I'm fine," Thomas slurred, continuing his performance while calculating distances and timing. "Just missing my sister. Can't stop thinking about her." "Of course you can't," Martha said gently, moving closer with maternal concern. "Losing someone so important is terrible, but you don't have to suffer alone. We're here to help." Thomas recognized the words as the same lies they'd probably told Emma, the same false comfort they'd used to lure other victims into trusting them. The rage that had been building in his chest for months threatened to overwhelm his carefully planned performance. "Really?" Thomas said, allowing hope to creep into his voice. "You'd really help me, even after everything I said about you?" "We understand grief makes people say things they don't mean," Ezra replied, his hand moving towards something concealed beneath his coat. "What matters is helping you through this difficult time." The moment had arrived. Thomas was face to face with his sister's killers, armed with knowledge and preparation they couldn't suspect. ready to finally provide the justice that conventional methods had been unable to deliver. But first, he needed them to reveal themselves completely, needed them to attempt the capture that would prove their guilt beyond any possible doubt. Thomas prepared for the most dangerous performance of his life, playing the perfect victim while remaining ready to become the instrument of their destruction. "You know," Thomas said, swaying slightly against the warehouse wall, "I've been thinking about what you said before, about Emma making choices I couldn't understand." He let his voice crack slightly, maintaining the performance while watching for the telltale signs that the Redwells were about to make their move. Martha stepped closer, her basket now within arm's reach. "That's exactly right, dear. Sometimes people we love make decisions that take them away from us, but that doesn't mean we should stop living ourselves." "But I keep having these dreams," Thomas continued, his hand inching toward the knife he'd concealed in his coat pocket. "Dreams where Emma's calling for help, where she's trapped somewhere and I can't reach her. They feel so real." Ezra moved to flank Thomas from the left side, his positioning clearly tactical rather than compassionate. "Dreams can feel real when we're grieving, son, but they're just your mind trying to process loss. Emma's at peace now." "At peace?" Thomas let genuine anguish creep into his voice. "How can she be at peace when I don't even know what happened to her? When her body is—" He trailed off, watching their expressions carefully. Martha's eyes glittered with something that wasn't maternal concern. "When her body is what, Thomas?" "Gone," Thomas whispered. "Completely gone. Like she never existed at all." "Sometimes that's a mercy," Ezra said quietly, and in those words Thomas heard the first crack in their facade. "Sometimes it's better not to know exactly what happened." Thomas straightened slightly, letting some of the alcohol act fade from his posture. "You sound like you speak from experience, Mr. Redwell." The change in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Martha's hand tightened on her basket handle, while Ezra's fingers moved closer to whatever weapon he carried. The pretense of chance encounter was beginning to crumble. "Experience," Martha repeated carefully. "Experience with making people disappear so completely that they might never have existed." Thomas's voice was steady now, all trace of drunken desperation replaced by cold certainty. "Experience with taking young women and turning them into something else entirely." Ezra's hand emerged from his coat holding a leather sap, a weapon designed to subdue rather than kill, perfect for capturing victims alive. "Thomas, you're clearly having another episode. Why don't you let us help you get home safely? Like you helped Emma get home safely?" Thomas stepped away from the warehouse wall, putting distance between himself and both Redwells while keeping his own weapons concealed. "Like you helped Maria Santos and Catherine Bloom and Rebecca Walsh." Marta opened her basket, revealing small bottles and cloth strips that confirmed Thomas's suspicions about their methods. "Poor boy, your delusions are getting worse. Captain Morrison was right about you needing professional help." "The only thing I need," Thomas said, his hand finally closing around his knife handle, "is justice for my sister and all the other women you've murdered." The pretense shattered completely. Ezra lunged forward with his sap, while Martha moved to flank Thomas from the right, their coordination revealing years of practice at capturing unwilling victims. But Thomas had been preparing for this moment, had visualized this exact scenario dozens of times. Thomas rolled away from Ezra's initial attack, drawing his knife in a fluid motion that brought the blade up toward the butcher's extended arm. The cut was deep and precise, severing tendons that would make it difficult for Ezra to grip his weapon effectively. Marta screamed, not in fear but in rage at seeing her partner injured. She pulled a wicked-looking filleting knife from her basket, its blade honed to razor sharpness. "You little bastard, after everything we've done for this community, after all our generosity..." Generosity. Thomas circled to keep both Redwells in view, his own blade ready. "You call murdering innocent women generous? You call feeding their flesh to unsuspecting customers generous?" Ezra was trying to stanch the bleeding from his wounded arm while maintaining his grip on the leather sap. You don't understand the nature of survival, boy. You don't understand what people will do when faced with true hunger, true desperation. I understand that you chose to become monsters, Thomas replied, looking for an opening that would let him disable one opponent before dealing with the other. I understand that you've been using your reputation to hunt and kill women who trusted you. Marta advanced with her knife held low, moving with the skill of someone familiar with butchering anatomy. They were better off dead than living the lives they had. At least this way, they served a purpose. What purpose? Thomas demanded, genuinely needing to understand the psychology that could justify such horrors. Feeding the community, Ezra said, as if the answer were obvious. Providing sustenance when game was scarce, when legitimate sources failed. We turned waste into nourishment. Waste. Thomas felt rage threatening to overwhelm his tactical awareness. Emma wasn't waste. She was my sister. She was a human being with hopes and dreams, and Marta struck while Thomas was distracted by emotion, her blade slicing toward his ribs with lethal precision. But Thomas had been expecting exactly this kind of attack, had prepared for the way his own anger might create vulnerabilities. He twisted away from Martha's thrust while bringing his own knife up in a defensive arc that opened a long cut across her forearm. The wound wasn't immediately incapacitating, but it would weaken her grip and slow her attacks. You want to know what happened to your precious Emma? Martha hissed, blood streaming from her wound. She begged at the end. She cried for her big brother to save her. But you weren't there, were you? You failed her completely. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, confirming his worst fears about Emma's final moments. But instead of breaking his concentration, the confirmation focused his rage into something cold and purposeful. You're right, Thomas said quietly. I failed to protect her, but I won't fail to avenge her. The final exchange came quickly. Ezra, handicapped by his wounded arm, tried to club Thomas with the sap while Martha attempted another knife thrust. Thomas dropped low, sweeping Ezra's legs while driving his own blade up toward Martha's chest. The knife found its mark between Martha's ribs, penetrating deep enough to puncture her lung. She staggered backward, blood frothing at her lips, her own weapon clattering to the alley floor. Ezra, off balance from Thomas's leg sweep, fell heavily against the warehouse wall. Thomas was on him immediately, pressing his knife to the butcher's throat with enough force to draw blood. Tell me exactly what you did to my sister, Thomas demanded. Tell me everything, or I'll make sure you die as slowly as possible. Ezra's eyes held the desperate calculation of a predator who'd become prey. She was scared at first, but Martha was kind to her, explained how she'd be helping feed hungry families. We made it quick at the end. Quick? Thomas pressed the blade deeper, feeling Ezra's pulse against the steel. After how long in your basement? After how much terror? A few days, Ezra gasped. We always kept them a few days to prepare them properly. But Emma was brave. She never stopped believing you'd come for her. The admission broke something fundamental in Thomas's chest. Emma had died believing in his protection, trusting that her brother would somehow find and rescue her. The faith she'd maintained even in her final moments made Thomas's failure absolute and unforgivable, but it also crystallized his purpose. He would ensure that no other sister would die believing in protection that never came. Thomas drew the blade across Ezra's throat in one clean motion, ending the butcher's life with the same efficiency the man had brought to killing innocent women. Martha was already dying from her chest wound, her breathing shallow and labored. As Thomas watched the life fade from Martha's eyes, he felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion. Justice for Emma required more than simply killing her murderers. It required exposing their crimes and ensuring that their victims were remembered. Thomas began searching the Redwells' bodies, looking for keys or information that might lead to wherever they'd relocated their basement operations. The evidence was still out there somewhere, and he would find it. Emma deserved a proper burial. All the victims deserved recognition and remembrance. The Redwells were dead, but Thomas's work was just beginning. 3 months after the confrontation in the alley, Thomas Merrick sat in the editorial office of the Kansas City Star. reviewing the final proofs of his exposé on the Redwell murders. The article had taken weeks to write and had required extensive verification from multiple sources. But it would finally give Emma and the other victims the recognition they deserved. The investigation that followed the discovery of the Redwell's bodies had vindicated Thomas's claims in ways that both satisfied and haunted him. Captain Morrison, prompted by the gruesome scene in the alley and Thomas's detailed documentation, had authorized a comprehensive search that revealed the relocated basement operations in an abandoned mill outside St. The evidence found there corroborated every aspect of Thomas's investigation. Personal belongings of 12 different women, processing equipment that confirmed the cannibalistic nature of the murders, and detailed records that the Redwells had kept of their victims and customers. The scope of their operation had exceeded even Thomas's worst estimates. Medical examinations of several Redwell customers revealed traces of human tissue in their systems, confirming that the butchers had indeed been selling human flesh disguised as premium game meat. The community's horror at learning they had unknowingly participated in cannibalism provided a grotesque coda to years of unwitting complicity. Thomas had been cleared of all charges related to the Redwells' deaths, with authorities ruling that he'd acted in self-defense against known murderers. But vindication felt hollow when weighed against the cost of achieving it. Emma was still dead, along with Maria Santos, Catherine Bloom, Rebecca Walsh, and 8 other women whose names were now carved on a memorial stone in St. Louis's city cemetery. The Kansas City Star had offered Thomas a position based on his investigative work and his commitment to giving voice to forgotten victims. The job provided both distance from the trauma of St. Louis and purpose that aligned with his transformed understanding of journalism's responsibility. "Ready for publication?" Editor Collins asked, reviewing Thomas's article one final time. "Yes," Thomas replied, thinking of Emma's gentle smile and her faith that her brother would somehow protect her. The victims deserved to have their stories told. The article would run in newspapers across the Missouri Territory, ensuring that the Redwell case became a cautionary tale about the predators who could hide behind community respectability. But more importantly, it would preserve the memory of young women who had been targeted for their kindness and vulnerability. Thomas had also established a fund to support families of missing persons, providing resources for investigations that might otherwise be dismissed or neglected. Emma's death had taught him that justice often required someone willing to look beyond surface appearances and fight for answers that others preferred to avoid. As he walked home through Kansas City's bustling streets, Thomas carried Emma's journal, the one she'd been writing in before her disappearance. Her final entries spoke of hope for the future, gratitude for her brother's protection, and determination to build something meaningful from the hardship they'd shared. Thomas would spend the rest of his life honoring that determination, ensuring that Emma's death had meaning beyond the evil that caused it. The Redwells were gone, but the commitment to justice they'd awakened would endure. In his own journal that evening, Thomas wrote, "Evil thrives in silence and respectability. But when truth finds its voice, even the darkest secrets cannot survive the light. Emma, this light burns for you."